Okay, hello to everyone, and welcome to this FMG Friends of Multilateralism Dialogue with Key Capitals and Brussels. So this is an initiative we launched this year, a new initiative by FMG to enhance dialogue with some key capitals. The purpose, in my personal point of view, are twofold. So the first is really to kind of enhanced dialogue between Geneva and key capitals, because we have always said that kind of smooth dialogue between Geneva and key capitals, and of course not only key capitals, but capitals of all members, will help a lot to advance WTO work, in particular the negotiations. The second would, of course, to promote, when we say key capitals, we want to encourage more leadership role by some major players. And of course, this is long needed, and we have been appealing to the major players to play leadership role. And fortunately, we have seen some coming during MC12, which has made MC12 a success. And as Alan just said, that is magnificent, with quite some achievements, which we will discuss tomorrow. So we hope that we start from Brussels, and we want to learn not only about how the EU's perspective on WTO reform, its negotiations, but also to understand more generally its trade policy perspective. So with that, I will stop here, and I will in particular thanks a lot to Stuart, who has been leading on this initiative in putting such an excellent panel together, and also developing the ideas on how we structure our discussion today. So with that, over to you, Stuart.
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction, Lou. I think you've set the scene very well. I'll just say, by way of my own introduction, that as we said in the flyer that we sent around for this session, international economic cooperation is needed more than ever, but is seriously challenged on many fronts. And as is often said, global problems require global solutions. As we know, the WTO is not only the forum for negotiations on its existing agreements, but also a venue for further developing multilateral trade relations. Almost everyone agrees that the world needs this organization, but it has, in overall terms, I think we would have to admit, struggled to deliver timely results. I think there was some respite from the critics last week when MC12 did indeed deliver a package of results. I see that Martin Wolf in the Financial Times a couple of days ago, and Martin is a very strong supporter and long-standing supporter of the multilateral trading system, described MC12 as a limited success, but he went on to say that this has at least kept the machine working. I think the members might feel a bit like that themselves, because in the outcome document for MC12, they did acknowledge the need for necessary reform with respect to all of the WTO's functions. But we would have to say that it's clear that there is as yet no common vision of the objective. A process is about to get underway in that respect. And as Lou said, the largest trading economies will undoubtedly play a key role in shaping that debate. And that's why the Friends of Multilateralism have launched this series of dialogues with key capitals. And so we're very happy and very pleased to be able to begin this series with what I think is a very timely dialogue with Brussels. And we're going to focus on two related questions. First of all, what future does the EU see for the WTO? And secondly, how does this relate to the direction of its trade policy more generally? Well, we couldn't ask for a better or more qualified panel than the one we have assembled today to discuss these questions. Ignacio Garcia Bercero is, of course, Director in charge of Multilateral Affairs, Strategy Analysis and Evaluation at DG Trade in the European Commission. Cecilia Malmstrom is currently a Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute, where she runs the highly successful Trade Winds series. She's also a member of FMG. And of course, during a glittering career, she was European Trade Commissioner from 2014 to 2019. And Iana Dreyer is the founder and editor of Borderlex, the leading independent publication on trade policy in Europe. Its focus is mainly on the European Union, with also post-Brexit trade policy and on key developments at the WTO. Fuller bios were distributed in the flyer for the event, so I'm not going to any more detail in that respect, but just suffice to say that we're very pleased and privileged to have such a distinguished cast today. And I'd like to thank them for giving us their valuable time. The format for our discussion is that I'll give the floor to each of the speakers in turn for about 8 to 10 minutes each. I may have a follow-up question of 2 of my own, and I'll also try to give the speakers an opportunity to react briefly to what the other speakers have said. And we will definitely try to leave enough time after that for a good exchange through questions or comments from our very knowledgeable audience. And you can indicate your wish to chip in that respect by using the chat or raise hand functions in Zoom in the usual way. So with that introduction, could I turn first to you, Ignacio, and perhaps pose a question to you? I leave it to you as to how you deal with that question. But it seems to me that we would be very interested to hear your overall assessment of the outcome from MC12 and whether or how this might affect the EU's attitude towards the WTO. Also, on WTO reform specifically, what are your objectives and priorities in terms of concrete reforms? And how do you see the reform debate or process unfolding? So over to you on that note, Ignacio.
Well, thanks a lot, Stuart, Lou, and thanks a lot for having me here again. I think the last time I talked with the Friends of Multilateralism was before MC12, and it is really a pleasant experience to be able to come back to you after we have had what I think undoubtedly is a very, very significant WTO ministerial meeting. You asked me what is our assessment of MC12. I think it is an unqualified positive assessment. I think it is something that has shown that the WTO has the capacity to be responsive to global challenges. I mean, last year, when we actually developed our trade policy strategy, we took the conscious decision to identify the WTO reform as a central priority for European Union trade policy. We even published a whole pamphlet about how we saw the WTO reform unfolding. I mean, I have to say that some people thought we are a little bit naive in the new geopolitical environment. What can you actually expect the WTO to deliver? And I think, quite frankly, we have been proven to be right. I think that the decision that we took to give priority to WTO reform, to push for an ambitious outcome in MC12, although it was extremely difficult and quite frankly was touch and go at many moments during the WTO ministerial, in our view was the right choice. And I think that the outcomes of MC12 have actually shown that there is the potential for this organization to become again a key player in the global trading system. Now, I'm not going to enter into the whole question about rating MC12 vis-a-vis other ministerial meetings, But if you compare NC12 with the two other arguably successful ministerial meetings since the DDA came unstuck, which was basically Bali trade facilitation, Nairobi export restrictions. I think in the case of NC12, we have at least three very significant outcomes that have taken place. Now, there are others, but at least three very significant outcomes. The agreement on fisheries subsidies, which is the first time that the WTO has developed a legally binding agreement based on sustainability, and also to tackle one of the most difficult issues to tackle in the WTO, which is subsidization, and an agreement which, quite frankly, when you compare it with other international rules that have been developed in other fora, like CTPPP or USMCA, it has a very high level of ambition. Now, it is not perfect, and we certainly think that we need to persevere to complete the work that we have started, but I think it's a very significant outcome. We also managed to agree on the issue of the TRIPS waiver, which was one of those issues which were very divisive for the membership, and were through patience, engagement, discussion to try to reconcile different perspectives. I think we managed to find a solution that was meaningful, that was responding to the fundamental expectations of some countries, particularly in Africa, and I would say particularly in the case of South Africa. And we set a path forward on the issue of WTO reform. I think that in my view, these are extremely significant outcomes, although at the same time, we have to be very, very careful not to be over complacent. I mean, there was a certain context in which these discussions took place. I think we should not forget that after Doha came Cancun. So I think what happens actually over the next year between now and NC13 is going to be critical. I think it's going to require an effort of alliance building and therefore of responsibility to try to make sure that we actually maintain the positive momentum in terms of the outcomes in the WTO. Now, you have asked us what are our priorities on the issue of WTO reform. Now, let me be very clear. I mean, WTO reform is something that requires contributions from everyone. It's not going to be simple. Not everything is going to be fixed between now and the next ministerial meeting. But we need to get the process moving forward, and we need to get meaningful outcomes. I mean, I would say that for us, fundamentally, a critical issue is going to be how we can try a way forward to restore a functioning dispute settlement system in the WTO. You cannot have a rule-based trading system without a functioning dispute settlement. Now, we are convinced that the key features of the 1995 agreement continue to be valid, but at the same time, we are very conscious that it is going to require imagination, it's going to require constructivity to try to find a way forward to have, again, a system of dispute settlement that everyone, including, of course, our friends in the United States, is ready to accept. And that, although it's not strictly speaking a target for 2020 for MC13, because it says 2024, is going to be critical that we engage in the meaningful discussion on dispute settlement reform, and that we start next year a process of text-based negotiations to see what changes need to be introduced in the dispute settlement system, which enhances legitimacy, which enhances effectiveness, but we do not depart from the fundamental elements of binding nature, independent adjudication, and an appellate body, even if it will have to be a reformed appellate body. So that continues to be a fundamental objective for us, and we're very much looking forward to engaging in those issues over the next year. Now, of course, WTO reform is much more than WTO dispute settlement, and I think it's going to require the constructivity and imagination to identify what is a package of reforms which can be agreed between now and MC13. We tend to think that we need to be looking into the monitoring and deliberating function as something on which it should be possible to identify ways to enhance the role of the WTO to monitor trade policy developments, where we should be able to see how a number of critical committees in the WTO can work better. So I think those are two areas which I think systemically should be important to see how we can move forward between now and the next ministerial meeting. But of course, at the end of the day, to revitalize the WTO, one also needs to look into the negotiating function. And there, quite frankly, I think there are two issues. I mean, the outcome of NC12 was really a boost for multilateralism. It demonstrated that it is possible to get agreements done at the multilateral level, which are significant. And I think, in my view, the fisheries subsidies negotiation is a very strong demonstration for multilateralism. But I think that we need to reflect about whether our way of negotiating multilateral agreements is necessarily the most effective one. I think some reflection about how to make the system work better when it comes to multilateral negotiations would be important. But of course, the other critical issue is how to integrate into the WTO open plurilateral agreements. There was not a lot of discussion about that issue in NC12 because the focus was much more on what we could deliver multilaterally. But I think it is clear that the future of the WTO is also going to require flexibility to accommodate open plurilateral agreements. We need to have a meaningful discussion on those issues. We need to understand why a few WTO members have problems with that. And I think we need to be able to understand better what their concerns and what their objections are. But for me, it's going to be very clear that between now and MC13, we need to make decisive progress on the three main plurilateral initiatives which are currently there in the WTO: investment facilitation, e-commerce, and of course, the whole trade and environment, trade and climate interface, which at the end of the day, I think is one lesson that we can also draw from NC12. If you have a strong sustainability justification for a certain type of agreement in the WTO, it makes it much easier to find a way to get an agreement multilaterally. So I think this whole trade and environment, trade and climate dimension, I think is going to be particularly important. So I think, Stuart, I would actually leave it there. I think we are certainly satisfied about the outcome of NC12. The process was, of course, a little bit messy, and actually one day before the extension of the conference, you could very easily have imagined everything collapsing, which would have been a tradition in the WTO. It would not have been the first time that you have a failed WTO ministerial meeting. And I suspect that it was a little bit the complexity of the geopolitical environment that also makes everyone be responsible and feel that they have to find a way to get into an outcome that keeps the expectation of having a functioning multilateral trading system very much alive. So all in all, I would say a quite reasonable outcome, but a lot of work to be done. And a risk that if we do not maintain the positive momentum from MC13, then the current optimism may very easily, very quickly disappear.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Ignacio. You've raised a large number of issues there and immediately sparked some questions in my mind. But in order not to create too much of a diversion, I think maybe we would move on and get Cecilia's take next, and perhaps circle back around for some questions a bit later. But thanks so much for that. Very clear readout on MC12 and on your priorities, I think, for WTO reform. So turning to you, Cecilia, the WTO has long been regarded as very central to EU trade policy. However, in recent years, we see the EU taking initiatives outside the WTO, for example, through proposed trade-related environmental and business governance measures, the Green Deal, and the due diligence for supply chains and things like that, CBAM, of course, and some others too. So I'd like to ask you, Cecilia, how you assess these trends in EU trade policy. And does it mean, in your view, that the WTO is perhaps less important to the EU than it was previously?
Well, thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Lou. And I'm delighted to be with all of you this afternoon. And of course, very pleased to be in a panel with Ignacio and Iana. Well, for the EU, the WTO is very important. I fully agree with Ignacio's assessment that sometimes the EU is seen as naive in its total hugging of WTO as an institution. But the EU works best in a multilateral setting where there are clear norms and international organizations that function. And when it doesn't, and today it doesn't, also beyond WTO, that creates a chaos where it's the rule of the jungle, and that's not a good thing. And if trade rules cannot be upheld, it is bad for the world, and it is bad for the EU, it is bad for all countries, and especially developing and smaller countries suffer the most. So that's why we need to continue to believe in WTO. I am also happy that there were clear outcomes and that it showed that the WTO can deliver, and there was a momentum. And I think Ignacio and of course Commissioner Dombrovskis and the whole team did a fantastic work to do this. So the EU has always worked to strengthen the WTO. In the Ottawa group, with a big group of like-minded, the EU has also, and I was personally engaged in that together with the US and Japan, tried to see if we could write new rules on subsidies and forced technology transfer and so on, and also finding an alternative ad hoc dispute settlement mechanism while waiting for the momentum to be able to reform the real one, which I really hope will be the consequence of this. So the EU will tirelessly continue to work and, of course, see where there is momentum and where reforms can come in. And realistically, of course, all big trade initiatives would be within the WTO, but that is not the case. So I think what you're referring to, Stuart, that the EU has taken other alternatives is not because we don't like the WTO. It's because we realize that right now it has not been possible to gain enough support within the WTO, but that the EU, together with others, can push and take the lead. I know I personally, but also I know that Commissioner Dombrovskis led side meetings on trade and environment now in Geneva, but that has also been the case in other occasions, also discussing labor laws, etc. And hopefully one day in a plurilateral way, these could be a realization within the WTO. But as long as that is not possible, I think the EU should continue to lead. And indirectly, that might strengthen the WTO as well. So the WTO has not worked well enough when it comes to level the playing field, for instance, because it's not updated on rules and some countries are not following the rules. So that's why the EU has taken initiative on investment screening, on anti-coercion, for instance, on due diligence, and it has also internally reformed its rules on public procurement, on state aid, which should then also be applied to foreign companies who have state aid in their portfolio as well. And this is to set the level playing field with other countries. And it should ideally have been done within the WTO, but now most of these are still subject to negotiations in the European Parliament and the Council, but some are there. And in many of them, there are discussions with other countries as well to inspire and to get to know. For instance, in the investment screening proposal, that has been a lot of cooperation with Japan, with the US, with Canada, Australia, and others. The CBAM is also a thing where, the natural place would, of course, to have it in the WTO, because I think pricing carbon is something that most international organizations, think tanks, economists agree is or not the only, but is one of the most important things to do if we want to fulfill the Copenhagen and then the Paris Agreement, putting a price on carbon. Now, the EU is now negotiating on the carbon border adjustment mechanism, but many countries have ways of taxing or pricing carbon, and that's a good thing. And if we could find a way to agree on the aims, maybe if we have slightly different methods, that would, of course, the WTO could harbor, ideally, a sort of supervisory role in that, because by all means, we, of course, want to avoid a trade war on carbon with countries who try to do the same. But there is, of course, a risk that this can lead to trade tension if we're not careful. I know that many discussions are ongoing, and that is, of course, a good thing. But I don't see it as a necessarily bad thing that the EU is going ahead and working with others and showing the way, with the aim, of course, of one day having global rules on this. The EU has also done a lot of individual trade agreements, regional and bilateral trade agreements the last years, which is also something that other countries have done as well, but now we focus on the EU. And that needs to continue because all the level playing field measures are good, but if you look at them individually, they all make perfectly sense. But if you look at them as a package, and if they're not balanced by open trade as well, we risk having a very protectionist EU, and that would be a very bad thing. So what the EU must do now, of course, is to ratify agreements that are done with Mexico and Chile, who has been laying there for a very long time. I think today, Prime Minister of New Zealand is in Brussels trying to see if they can close the final nitty detail in the agreement between EU and New Zealand, and that would be a good thing as well. New Zealand is a very close friend and ally, and we should speed up negotiations with Australia, Indonesia, and others. And of course, we shouldn't touch upon this here, but you know, the tensions with our friends in UK and Brexit is not a good thing for our trade relations. So that has to be solved as well. So I think this can go on in parallel, in full transparency, in openness, and in dialogue with friends and allies. And that is not a bad thing. I agree with Ignacio that we should opt for the plurilaterals within WTO and try to bring in issues there. We have lots of crises going on at this moment. We have a food crisis, we have a health crisis, we have a climate crisis, we have an ongoing war, and even if WTO cannot solve all these problems, at least we should strive for common global action. And I think there were positive steps taken at MC12. It could have been further, but it could also have been a big failure and slamming of the door. I have also been in those meetings where those have happened. So we need now to accelerate and prepare for MC13 as well, build on the momentum and put all brilliant minds together to see how realistically we can move forward. And I am confident that the European Union, with friends and others, will be willing to take the lead, or at least engage as much as possible, because we also need to remind ourselves and others that trade will be a very important part of the global recovery after the COVID crisis. And there WTO can, of course, play a very important role. I'll stop there, Stuart. I know that there are lots of other things to discuss.
Thanks very much indeed, Cecilia. That's really excellent, and I thought that was a great explanation about maybe how the EU has become, as you say, a little less naive about the WTO and understands the limitations, the practical limitations and the time limitations of working through the WTO. I thought that was interesting. It just occurred to me while you were talking that, you know, we hear a lot about the EU's trade policy, and that there's this terminology: open, assertive, and sustainable. This is the mantra, as I understand it. I mean, where do you see the balance here? Is it as open as it should be, or is the emphasis now, in your view, more on the assertive and sustainable rather than the open? Just be interested if you've got a quick reaction to that one.
Well, now that I'm a totally independent individual, I can speak very freely. I think it's also open strategic autonomy, where the open seem to have been falling away somehow. I think that there is a risk, and it would be interesting to hear what Iana says about this, that with the focus, as I mentioned briefly, the focus on the level playing field items, which are very important. I'm not against any of them, but if they're not combined with continuing trying to push for free trade agreements, ratifying deals that have been done for years, which just laying there and giving the EU bad reputation, and not continuing with ongoing negotiations, I think the balance is on the wrong side. And this last year it has. So I hope there is a change in sight for the autumn.
Thanks very much, Cecilia. And so let me turn to Iana now and ask Iana a question. Welcome again, Iana. Very good to have you with us. I'd just like to ask you, what are the trends that you see in EU trade policy? And whether you think a reformed WTO can be an effective channel for the EU to promote its regulatory and other interests with trading partners, given what we all know about the inevitable compromises and complications that are associated with negotiations in Geneva? Or do you think, on the contrary, that most of the action will be bilateral, regional, or otherwise outside the WTO? Over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Lou. Thank you, Stuart, for having me here. It's really a great honor to be on this very distinguished panel. It's hard to come after Cecilia Malmstrom in particular, obviously. But if you ask me the question, I think, at the very beginning of her term, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announced she was going to lead a geopolitical commission. That was in the autumn 2019, and I'm not sure she or anyone else had grasped the full implication of this statement. But now, 2.5 years in, we are in the thick of it, whether it was desired or not. But that's where we are in a highly geopolitically charged environment. So trade policy coming out of Brussels is now subsumed into this wider political and geopolitical context. I think the discussions in Brussels on trade have evolved from a traditional framework of looking at trade as a prosperity enhancing, efficiency enhancing tool to a discussion about how trade is done and where trade is done. So it's probably potentially be a lot of fun for geeks, the WTO geeks dealing with PPMs and things like that. So it has led to trade restrictions, new trade liberalizations. It's all in flux. But I think the wider picture is that the war in Ukraine, the actions taken in the war in Ukraine follow on other crisis events that we have had for at least 5 years. I think there's the Trump let's talk about the Trump administration, which I think was a game changer in Brussels and how it sees itself in the world. To be seen as one of the potential enemies, trade enemies at least, is something in Brussels. This sort of strategic solitude that was felt in Brussels is strong and continues to shape worldview. Obviously, China's rise, all the pandemic era related supply chain crisis and related geopolitical frictions, both at the beginning in particular with the Trump administration, but also with China. The climate crisis, which I think, given the searing heat we all feel right now, is becoming real to many, and there's a real political push to get things done. And also, I think there is a shock of not having been the key innovator in the digital sphere. So overcompensating a little bit with regulating all this. I think there is a subtle effects of Brexit, not that it has reduced much of the power of the EU or anything, but it has shifted the balance of power within the EU to other actors. So I think the relative power of the French, in particular the Germans, and in combination with the Poles or the Spanish, depends on the topic. It's a different place than just a few years ago. So, these instruments have already emerged. The central areas of focus right now are many autonomous instruments. It's about strengthening the strategic autonomy of the EU and leveling the playing field. I don't know how much evidence-based this is or not, but this is the task. This is also linked to the net zero Green Deal goals and the digital. Everything is green, digital, geopolitics are all mixed up. There is a China dimension to all of this. There's a US dimension to all of this. Whether you do green or digital, everything is mixed up. And once in a while, you have a bit protectionist politics thrown into all this, although it's not necessarily systematic or the fundamental goal of the policy in itself. But you have sometimes these politics coming in, like with CBAM. Yeah, so I mean, we can discuss the instruments itself, but I'm just going to list it, the rolling out of the investment screening regulation, IPI, so reciprocity in public procurement, foreign subsidies. There's an anti-coercion instrument coming, which could be very interesting. There is also the whole supply chain resilience action, sort of the European Chips Act, where it's about having more production in Europe in the semiconductor sphere, which could be interesting for people in the WTO looking at subsidies questions. We have this drive to regulate global supply chains more widely, also on the climate and labor front, coming forced labor product import ban that will be tabled in September. We have ongoing legislation being prepared on a deforestation product import ban. I think these are possible palm oil type of conflict potential, depending how they are designed. For those who are familiar with the EU's palm oil disputes with Indonesia and Malaysia. And of course, there's CBAM. I think we have a domestic problem in the EU, like in any domestic legislation. The Commission has actually territory and would, as much as possible, fly with any appellate body member if there's that. We have a parliament that doesn't necessarily see things the same way, and we have council and some member states that don't see things the same way. So we have now, we're in the final stages of this regulation, so we have potential export rebate or sort of an exemption to a parallel removal of free emissions trading allowances coming into the picture, which could lead to trade frictions and policy conflicts landing potentially in Geneva down the road coming. And there's the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, which is all in preparation, the Artificial Intelligence Act, all currently in the making. This is also obviously affecting some EU positions in the WTO itself. I've noticed a changing EU position on the little topic of prohibition of revealing the source code, which was one of the topics in the e-commerce GSI. Brussels is changing its position on that one, wants to have an exception for regulation purposes. This is a direct consequence of the fact that it is preparing to regulate AI. So whatever is coming out of Brussels will land in Geneva one way or the other, very often in a defensive way. One thing. The other issue I wanted to raise that given what the EU is doing right now, and also others are doing, such as the US is also trying to increase its supply chain resilience, etc., subsidizing, etc. So there is a big focus on trying to avert frictions with the United States and building something. So I think that for me, the key event in trade policy over the last year has been the Trade and Technology Council with the United States, which is an elaborate and at times actually highly effective talk shop, crisis management coordination shop, as it has proven to be, in actions towards Russia, for example. This is a spot to watch, because if it works, down the road, I mean, we probably need a few iterations of those meetings before we see much tangible action, but we could see potentially even positive outcomes that could be useful or conducive for better multilateral governance in some areas, such as standardization, for example. So it's a double-edged sword at the moment, but there's a real effort out of Brussels to reduce trade frictions from what it's doing with key trading partners. And there might be something further down the road if the two sides manage to keep the momentum on the TTC. The TTC model seems to be working so well that the EU is doing another one with India. it has something that has similar patterns with Japan and possibly with Singapore, sort of these digital partnerships. It's about coordinating semiconductor supply chains, talking about digital regulations, etc. Everything is non-committal, but it's mainly about talking to allies, having these communication channels, doing supply prices, for example, and try to avert any trade or regulatory accidents with key trading partners. It's an interesting approach. It needs to mature over time and actually deliver at some point something legally binding. But given that everything is in flux, including the digital sphere, I think it's why not? So to come to this issue, to the second question is, can a reformed WTO be an effective channel for the EU to promote its regulatory and other interests? I would turn this question around. Will the EU make WTO reform possible? A bit provocative. I would say two things. In many ways, in the best cases, I think in some areas, the EU will need more time to work out some of its new positions in emerging areas of regulation, such as digital and even probably climate. I think that what is coming out of Brussels is not, when we see that with the e-commerce, adding another controversy with the source code issue, it's not necessarily conducive to having a quick deal, let's say, on this GSI right now. If you see that GSIs are one of those reform deliverables of the WTO, not everyone sees that. I think we've heard a lot from India on this. And I think what is important, and more than ever, perhaps, even if it's not the most decisive factor, but it's one of the most decisive. It's a necessary condition for any successful WTO reform, is that there is some understanding with Washington and some of the key topics. That's why I think this TTC process is important over time. And I think it has been actually helpful in getting the outcome we had at MC12 on WTO reform, because this sort of bilateral engagement, maybe you're more, Ignacio is doubtful, but I've seen from afar, it doesn't look that bad. I think it's important to have this relationship there. I also think the EU's new approach to subsidies, these new initiative, semiconductors, some regulation, there's some technicalities with state aid rules that might be relaxed that could pose a problem in future. And I'm not entirely sure where the conversation is with the US on reforming subsidies, which was dominant during the Trump administration on, having more subsidies disciplines in the WTO to have more, so that Chinese trade, companies are more disciplined. I have the feeling that this conversation is not really going anywhere. I see nothing coming at the moment immediately, even after the Airbus Boeing tariff truce, where both sides said they would be talking. So I don't know where this is, but I find it has somehow disappeared from the radar. That's it. But fundamentally, I don't think, the EU is the biggest, I think I share actually at the same time the assessment of both Ignacio and Cecilia that the EU is the most ardent defender of the WTO in all this, when you look at many of the big powers, and the most active and the most engaged. So I think if there's responsiveness on the other side, in Washington, in New Delhi, in China, I think you can work with the EU. I think that's a central tenet, and I think there is sincerity out of Brussels in terms of making the WTO work in future. A little bit to that.
Thanks very much indeed, Iana, and it was very good of you, I think, to enumerate the many initiatives that are, and discussions and debates that are taking place in Brussels, and I think that kind of, in a way, puts the WTO in a bit of a context, which is interesting. So I'm now going to ask the panelists if there's anything they would like to add or react to in terms of what the others have said. And then after that, I'm going to open the floor for other participants to ask questions. And as I said, you use the chat function or put your hand up. So, but before we just come to that, let's have a quick round again amongst the panelists. I see, Ignacio, you've got your hand up. So I think you've got something you want to either add or react to based on what Cecilia or Iana has said.
No, so I just wanted to comment on what Iana said, because I was in no way implying that the cooperation with the United States has not been very instrumental in the outcomes of NC12. Certainly, the good cooperation between EVP Dombrovskis and Ambassador Tai has been extremely helpful in trying to come to good, high-quality outcomes in NC12. But I would want to make a more general point. In my view, it was actually a very good initiative from the Director General Negozi to get the United States, the European Union, India, and South Africa to sit down in a room and to try to find a way forward on the most controversial aspect of the WTO agenda, which was how to respond to the TRIPS waiver. Now, you can make whatever evaluation you can make about the outcome, but it was a politically extremely complex exercise where there was a huge investment to try to find a solution that met the expectations of the key proponent on this, which was basically South Africa. And I think that the better knowledge that was reached between the four key ministers on those issues through the discussions leading to the outcome of the waiver, in my view, were also very helpful in the process of the ministerial meeting to try to get to outcomes. I think it's clear that EVP Dombrovskis has now a very good relationship developed not only with Ambassador Tai, but also with Minister Patel from South Africa, with Minister Goyal from India. There were some trouble moments during the ministerial meetings in which I think conversations among the key players were extremely instrumental. And that's why I think in order to move forward on WTO reform, yes, cooperation with the United States is obviously important and it's going to be critical, particularly if we want to find a solution on dispute settlement reform. But I think we should not certainly forget the perspective of other key WTO members. India is going to be a very important player. South Africa and the African group is going to be an important player. We should not forget that the final deal on fisheries subsidies was basically a negotiation between the ACP group and a group of other countries to try to identify an agreement that had the high level of ambition, but we maintained the incentive to negotiate on the rest, because that was the critical issue in the discussion with the ACP group. So I think if we want to move towards meaningful outcomes on NC13, transatlantic cooperation is good, absolutely, but it's certainly not enough. And we really need to try to find how you can create a different type of dynamic, including with countries we may have somehow different perspective about what WTO reform is all about.
Thanks very much for adding that, Ignacio. And Iana, I'll give you the floor next.
Thank you. Just to finger a quick reaction. I completely agree with Ignacio. It seems to, I mean, my focus was more on these new topics that are not really yet in the WTO, sort of this whole climate dimension and the digital field. Completely agree on all the rest, what was said by Ignacio. But just to where I do think it's important that there is a common understanding between the US and the EU, because otherwise, you know, how are you going to deal with China, India, and all these matters? But does that, you know, one doesn't contradict the other.
Thanks, Iana. I mean, it did occur to me listening to the discussion on the Transatlantic Technology Council and US-EU relations. I mean, it's all very well to have this sort of love-in right now, but I mean, there's going to be another US election in a couple of years. So I'm just wondering whether the EU thinks this is going to stick, this new friendship. And of course, we have some people on the call from the US side. So if they've got any views on that, that would be interesting as well. Cecilia, would you like to add anything, or not now? A little later, up to you.
A little later, but this Trade and Technology Council, I think it is important, especially in the trust building era, because there has been tensions on a variety of items during the last years, and the Trade and Technology Council, combined with a very close cooperation on the Ukraine and Russia sanctions, of course, where there's been more phone calls or video calls between Brussels and Washington the last 4 months than the last 5 years, which is also trust building. But trade and technology, it's very much about technology and others. It's very little about trade in the term of trade liberalization or trade facilitation or market access. So it's not the embryo of a new TTIP. Which could be a pity, but I mean the politics are as they are, and there's no chance in any of those partners that this would be realistic to embark right now. But it's a bit misleading, the name, actually. I think it's very valuable that they create these different working groups. Hopefully will sustain whoever sits in the White House, whoever sits in Berlaymont, but it's actually not a trade corporation.
Thanks for that, Cecilia. That's useful. Well, we have an indication in the chat from Alejandro Jara that he would like to ask a question on my favorite subject and his favorite subject, agriculture. But he hasn't given us any details, so I think he's going to hit us with something out of left field. Alejandro, over to you.
Thank you, Stuart, and thanks to Iana, Cecilia, and Ignacio. Fantastic panel. And to you for your moderation, Stuart. I've heard a lot about level playing field and about subsidies, but little, if anything, on agriculture. I say this because this is part of any package in the future. And like carbon pricing, my guess is agriculture requires multilateral action. Disarmament would be a more appropriate word, perhaps. And it would not be, it cannot be solved through plurilateral GSI unless GSI is of such massive proportions in terms of the critical mass that it might work if only irrelevant actors do not participate. So in the past, what we have seen the EU undertaking over the years an important internal reform on agriculture, welcome, and two, a fantastic initiative with Brazil that led to prohibition on export subsidies on agriculture in 2015 in Nairobi Ministerial. So since I did not hear very much on agriculture from any of you, I would like to ask the question: how important is this now for the EU in terms of international cooperation? Agriculture may not be a big offensive interest for the EU unless geographical indications are involved, but it seems that for action in the WTO and reform in the future, it might be a very important topic to build trust. And what are the prospects of repeating the kind of leadership that the EU exercised way back in 2015 on export subsidies? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alejandro. Let's note that one and take a couple more questions, and then we'll circle back to the panel and get their views on the assembled questions. So, Alan Wolf, I see you've got your hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists in particular for their elucidation of the EU role, which was extraordinarily important to any success at MC12, obviously, with the TRIPS negotiation. And my question really goes to how to approach the individual subjects that Ignacio has raised. The dispute settlement issue, for example, the problem is the United States to begin with. It's not the only actor that would be interested in the subject, but it's the primary actor. So is it promising at present? Does it look good? Is there optimism that something can be done with this administration? And then, of course, it might need cooperation from China if certain subsidy issues are involved, and from others with respect to trade remedies if it comes to that. So how does that look? Secondly, the monitoring role, does there seem to be a lot of interest on the part of other members in giving the Secretariat more of a role? Is that going to be controversial? The negotiating function, it appears that just doing something has a positive effect. So that's a major breakthrough. But how does one get the JSIs to become legitimate in the WTO? And I guess corollary to all of this is there are other approaches that are possible. So does the New Zealand agreement have in it things for the WTO in terms of a template, a way of moving forward? Does the EU see a possibility of joining DPA? Is that of interest? CPTPP with the UK and China and others seeking to join CPTPP. Is that an alternative, perhaps road back to Geneva, or is it of no interest at all? Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. You've given us a bit of a list there. That's great. Let me go to Lou next for a question, and then after that, I'll ask the panelists if they want to respond.
Thank you, Stuart. Thanks a lot to the whole panel for excellent presentations. I have two questions, one probably for Ignacio, specifically on WTO reform as related to MC12 outcome. And if we compare the outcome with the EU proposal quite some time before the MC12, we could see that the level of ambition was brought down a lot. I mean, we did see next ministerial, we see that the process is launched. We did see that it's going to be framed under the General Council and the subsidiary bodies. But a lot of details which were contained in the EU proposal about specific pillars, the bullet points, and also text-based, and also a working group, all these are gone. So my question to Ignacio would be that the timelines here, so is pressing, and how would the EU continue to lead that process, especially in terms of the structure, institution, on the General Council dedicated session, or again, possibly a working group or subgroups. And also there's an interesting footnote there saying that groupings of members could also sit down and discuss and make proposals. So that's also an interesting part to listen to Ignacio. A second question to both Cecilia and Iana would be that within the EU, we always say, when I was in Brussels more than 20 years ago, we used to talk about Troika. So it was France, Germany, and the UK. But now it's more like Germany and the UK. But we did see that, Germany and France. But we did see that recent election in France was not helping President Macron a lot. And also the leadership change in Germany was also something that people are discussing. So I just wonder, the question would be that how this kind of internal key member states of the EU, their domestic politics or election changes, all this would affect the EU trade policy, particularly under the WTO. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Lou. Well, we've got three good sets of questions there. I mean, Alejandro on agriculture, and then
Stuart, you are muted. Sorry, Stuart, yeah. You're muted. Yeah.
Sorry. Sorry, I was just saying that we've got three good sets of questions there from Alejandro on agriculture and from Alan on dispute settlement and how promising that's looking, the monitoring role, negotiating function, etc. and then Lou's questions about, how the EU could lead on WTO reform, and then the question of the internal politics in the EU. So who would like to go first amongst our speakers on that?
I'm happy if you want, Stuart, to start, since a lot of the questions have to do with what happened in MC12 and what will happen afterwards. Now, first, in response to Alejandro, what happened on MC12 on agriculture? Now, it was very clear throughout the ministerial conference there was an extremely divergent position. On the one hand, from India, that was absolutely insisting on PSH giving priority over any other aspect of the agricultural agenda, and the Kearns group that were insisting that one needed to provide guidance to advance on the different components of agricultural reform. And quite frankly, this difference could not be reconciled. And I think in my view, it was a positive thing that rather than sinking the whole ministerial because of this difference, which is what happened in Buenos Aires, it was decided we cannot agree at this point in time on agriculture, but let's try to make sure that across the board we get out as many outcomes as possible. And I think that in my view was good decision taking both by the Kearns and India, which were, if you want, the opposite sides of this whole discussion. Now, if you want to say about what was the European Union position, I mean, the European Union position understands that India has a legitimate expectation about finding a permanent solution on PSH. It was clearly unrealistic to expect to have it during MC12, but we certainly believe that this is an issue on which there's a need to engage as a matter of priority. And at the same time, we are certainly very interested in moving forward on reform of trade-distorted domestic support. Ms. Alejandro has said we have done domestic reforms in the European Union, which others haven't done. So from our point of view, it would have been very good to be able to move on both issues. Now, what is going to be now the way forward? Quite frankly, I think that the dust needs a little bit to settle. We all need to think what is the more productive way to continue the agricultural conversation for MC13. Certainly, as far as the European Union is concerned, as I said, we see that there is a legitimate expectation from India on the issue of PSH, but at the same time, any outcome on PSH needs to be subject to safeguards to prevent distortions of competition. And at the same time, we certainly would wish to find a way forward, particularly to move on the issue of further reductions of trade distorting domestic support.
Finally.
Now, on the...
Got it to shut up.
Sorry.
No, let's have a look.
Okay, Patrick. No, I think that you are connected. Okay, on the questions raised by Alan. To be very frank, Alan, at this point in time, we do not really know exactly what it is the expectation of change from the United States. I mean, I think it is positive that the United States agreed already last year, by the way, that by 2024, which I hope means before November 2024, that there will be an agreement about a fully functioning dispute settlement system. And at the same time, it is also very clear that the United States at least is giving signals that they are ready to engage, and they have started on the process of discussion in Geneva, although for the time being, it is not yet moving into text-based negotiations. It is much more identification of interest. So I think these are positive signals, and we are certainly quite ready to try to see how we can take that forward. But at this point in time, quite frankly, I do not know what it is that the United States thinks it needs to be done to be able to have again a fully functioning dispute settlement system in the WTO. And any suggestion that you can have in terms of how to advance this discussion with the US, I would certainly be very, very interested. Now, on the whole question of the monitoring role, I mean, I think, Alan, in my view, you really touch on a very fundamental question. I mean, if you really want to have a more effective monitoring system in the WTO, you need to accept some degree of role of initiative for the Director General and the WTO Secretariat. You need to be able to accept that the WTO DG should be able to cooperate with other international organizations. And that traditionally has always been a little bit of a no-go area for the United States. Now, we haven't really at this point in time started to have a more substantive discussion about what it is that can be done to to improve the monitoring function of the WTO. There are some ideas on the table on transparency of notifications, which we of course support. But in my view, we really wanted to make the WTO more useful to its members. We would need to go a little bit beyond the notification system. And by the way, we also really need to look into the functioning of the committees, particularly the committees that really matter. I mean, the Committee on Trade and Environment, the Committee on Trade and Development, the Committee on Subsidies. These are all committees which will really be able to perform much, much better than they actually do at this point in time. Now, on the issue of GSIs, well, I mean, the European Union is also engaging on digital issues bilaterally. We are going to aim to negotiate a digital chapter with Japan. We are engaging in discussion with Singapore. So certainly we are ready to engage bilaterally in different configurations. But for us, quite frankly, there is not an alternative to try to agree in the context of Geneva or the WTO on a digital agreement. And the e-commerce negotiations are advanced. I really think it's going to be a question of the members of the GSI to give the necessary political priority to advance in the context of the Geneva negotiations. And quite frankly, no one has explained to me why it is going to be easier to agree on this question in the Indo-Pacific than in Geneva. So my sense is, I hope it is going to be possible to find a way of moving forward on the e-commerce GSI, and at the same time to engage multilaterally, because I have not talked a lot about the e-commerce moratorium, but I think we got a very, very clear signal that we cannot continue to assume that this is going to be extended conference after conference. We really need to be able to understand a little bit better what are the concerns of some countries about policy space, and we need to be ready to have also a meaningful multilateral discussion on the issues relating to e-commerce. I mean, finally, on the question about the ambitions on WTO reform, well, I wouldn't be terribly concerned, quite frankly, that it is going to be done in the General Council that are in a working group. At the end of the day, this is going to be a member-driven process. And it's really going to depend on the dynamics which are actually being presented, on the capacity of members to put forward initiatives, and then can we actually create a dynamic to find a way to move forward on the different issues. So it was already quite some time ago, quite frankly, that we decided that it was going to be too difficult to agree on a working group with a detailed mandate. It would have to be subject to all kinds of conditionalities. And quite frankly, this rather metaphysical discussion that we have in NC12 about exactly the role of the General Council and its relationship with the members, which is reflected in this famous footnote that you referred to, for us, it's a bit beside the point. I mean, at the end of the game, this is going to be a member-driven process. There's going to be depending about the capacity of members to put forward meaningful proposals to engage, and there will always be a way to find a way forward if the members are ready to engage. I don't think a working group or the General Council would make a fundamental difference.
That's very helpful, I think, Ignacio, to give us a better feel for the situation. Cecilia or Iana, would you like to respond to the questions?
Yes, I can give some comments. Of course, Ignacio answered very thoroughly on this agriculture, and he knows that much better than I know right now. On this situation in the European Union, whatever happens, the French and German axis is very strong and very important. And it has been for a very long time. It has survived many prime ministers, presidents, and Bundeskanzlers, and it will remain strong. Now, of course, there is a new reality, both in Germany with a relatively new chancellor who's for the first time also leading a coalition government. Some of us know how it is to be in that kind of government, but of course it's a new situation, so that creates tensions in Germany. And for the French president, of course, he obviously finds himself in a very awkward situation with the new parliamentary situation, where he will probably, at least initially, try to find jumping majorities on this. But the French president in the constitution has a very strong role over European and foreign policy, independently of the parliament. It's not like in Denmark or Finland and Sweden, where the parliament has to approve every important European decision. In France, the president has a very strong role there. So I don't think that would change a lot. on these matters. I mean, France has obviously a very strong position on certain items. Sometimes they agree with the rest of Europe, sometimes they don't. That would probably remain the same. The French-Italian axis has also been very strengthened since Mr. Draghi took over in Italy, and that is an interesting development to watch. When it comes to WTO reform, my experience, maybe Ignacio has someone, but during the time I was there is a quite unanimous view on this. I mean, this is not the subject where members diverge, fundamentally. It could be on details, but that has been a quite unanimous voice on what needs to be done in the WTO. So I don't see any changes there. On EU internal trade policy, there will always be discussions, of course, and that will continue more or less the same way. When I was Trade Commissioner, we discussed whether the EU should join the TPP, as it was called. Then of course, that has materialized. It is, the organization is now called TPP, another acronym that you have to learn, and is working. And the feeling back then was that trade-wise, it would not really improve the situation compared to existing bilateral agreements that the EU has with several of CPTPP members, and negotiations ongoing with others. By the way, Mia just alerted me, and I checked that the agreement with EU and New Zealand has been confirmed right now, which is very good news. But I think geopolitically, and this is my personal view, it would make sense for the EU to join CPTPP to help to develop standards and set them in there. So geopolitically, we send a very important political signal, even if trade-wise it might not increase market access on very, but there are discussions ongoing there that are interesting. DPA is also very interesting. The e-commerce agreement between New Zealand, Singapore, and Chile, and I think Canada is about to join. China has expressed interest, and several other, South Korea as well. Of course, I mean, the aim of this is to make it compatible with plurilateral or one day maybe multilateral agreements, even if it goes a little bit further than what is actually being negotiated in Geneva. So it's a very interesting cooperation, and I congratulate partners for that. But I don't think we should give up, because we are close in Geneva. There are still some difficult items to solve there. But if we could agree on a plurilateral e-commerce directive in Geneva with almost 90 countries involved, including EU, US, China, and many others, also developing countries, that would really be. So if EU joining that would somehow jeopardize development in Geneva, I think we should maybe follow it closely and have an open mind, but not apply at least not right now.
Great, thanks a lot, Cecilia. Iana, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not such a deep WTO technologist, especially in agriculture. But I think I want to give two sorts of answers to Alejandro. From someone who sees this from afar, I mean, I'm very struck at how during the food crisis now, compared to the vaccine and medical pandemic, PPM equipment crisis just in 2020, where there was a lot of action in the WTO, in the Secretariat being very active in naming and shaming people, countries, publishing which countries were enacting which restrictions, that countries were notifying, that there was a political pressure to notify your measures, etc., etc. Nothing on that now. Although actually, I mean, this is really, food crisis happening. So I wonder if there can be some more action from export-friendly countries that include Latin America and the EU to push the WTO more to do so. That's what I see on the food and agriculture issue. But on the other issue, on EU leadership, I'm not sure how much outsiders have realized how the paradigm has shifted in Brussels from to this sort of PPM, so production methods outcome, and it's everywhere. It's about regulating textiles. It's about regulating all sorts of supply chains, deforestation, import ban. This is potentially a huge disruption. There's a growing conditionality on developing countries, climate and labor. The general scheme of preferences is being overhauled. It's going to be an essential requirement to comply with the Paris Agreement, and a lot of that has to do with agriculture. So I think there is a big thing coming out of Brussels. I think we need to be braced for it, and especially developing countries and emerging markets need to have some form of response. You know, you can't just shout protectionism because you have to have a conversation with the EU to get somewhere. But this is coming, and I think this is a fundamental shift that has happened. I might also on the elections in France and Germany. I wonder how the current crisis we have with Ukraine, because we've unplugged quite brutally our economic relationship with Russia. There's a lot of fear in Germany in particular, of fretting about what will happen to the trade relationship with China, which is very deep and really fundamental for Germany. At the same time, there's a recognition that there will be a need for diversification and potentially a big shock on the trade relationship if something bad happens on the geopolitical front. So there is a big push in Germany to ask for diversification of trade relationships, which I think is conducive to a potentially more active FTA agenda in the coming months. This is already visible. Just last week, the German coalition issued a few principles on trade policy. The Greens are happy with the new trend, the new action plan of the EU on TSD chapters, on labor and environment chapters in FTAs, where there's going to be potentially sanctions down the road. So that makes the Greens happy. And now, you know, it's clearly stated as one of the first priorities in the coalition statement: we need to diversify. So this is probably going to act, and that's probably where and if you're in the sort of pro-FTA optimistic kind of camp, you can say that with allies such as the Nordic countries and others, even in Southern Europe, that are a bit more pushing for the FTAs to make progress, there might be a little bit of a paradigm shift there. I don't see this concretely with WTO because I don't have the feeling there's much going on in market access to the WTO. But the trade dynamics could change a little bit on the German side. France, paralysis. I mean, I don't see how CETA, for example, it's sort of a benchmark. The agreement with Canada can be ratified in France. Probably what the government will continue never to table it to Parliament for ratification. So it's going to be difficult. But as you know, Cecilia has sat there, you know, sat in the middle of this and as an observer. I mean, no immediate fundamental change, rather than more of the same. On CPTPP and DPA, I have a slight different reading, but this is my personal policy opinion. I mean, I don't see, for example, the DPAs, I don't see how they're incompatible with e-commerce. I mean, they were designed, as far as I understand, as a complement. It's something that can be used with e-commerce more generally. So I don't see where the contradiction is. And with CPTPP, I think it's more a question of realism on the technocratic side of FTAs. I think it's very difficult to reconcile the different models. That said, I do think the EU must now become much more creative in designing trade initiatives, including with market access in the whole Asia-Pacific region, especially in Southeast Asia, and something a bit more flexible than it has now, because if it wants a deal with Indonesia, free trade, I'm going to be there in 20 years still. So I think something needs to be done, and I don't see it coming.
Thanks, Iana. And I took your point about the need to brace, given the enormous agenda that's coming forward in Brussels on several fronts. I feel pretty much the same way, I must admit. I agree with you on that one. a bumpy ride, perhaps in prospect. We shall see. Well, we still got a few minutes. If anybody would like to ask a question, please put your hand up. I've got one that I would like to just mention, but I would like to give priority to others. And I see Bernard Hookman has put his hand up. So Bernard, go ahead, please.
Hi, yeah, thanks. So just, I guess, to Ignacio primarily, but also Cecilia. So yeah, there's been a lot of chatter based on Janet Yellen's speech, right, where she's saying, well, we should start thinking about friendshoring. So I think one of the questions that a lot of us have, at least people I've been talking to, so where does the EU come down on this, right? So clearly we have the Trade and Technology Council, we have the bilateral relationship, which, you know, as you all have been saying, was quite fraught and now hopefully is a bit better, but might become much worse again in a couple of years. But anyway, so we have the WTO, we have trade agreements, which the US doesn't like. The US is moving down this other path. So are we part of the friendshoring group? How do we deal with this? And in particular, you know, how does that then tie into what we might do in the WTO to kind of try and multilateralize some of this insofar as that is possible? Anyway, I look forward to your views on that.
Who would like to go on that one?
Well, it's a very provocative question from Bernard, of course. I couldn't expect anything different from him. No, I think that in my view, you really need to look into European Union trade policy as having to be sufficiently flexible to combine the different type of agreements. Now, for us, the WTO continues to be central in terms of defining the rules of the game. And that's why I think that no matter what happens, we will continue to give a priority to have a functioning rule-based trading system and seeing how far we can use the WTO first to make sure that we have again a rule-based trading system, because without dispute settlement, you don't have a rule-based trading system anymore. And then to see how we can actually try to also generate dynamics in the WTO to modernize the rules. And I think there are different routes which can be followed. There's the multilateral route and it's the plurilateral route. On the other hand, quite frankly, I do not really see market access as something that one can realistically expect to do in the context of the WTO in the near term. Maybe something very targeted on climate-related goods and services. That is something that we would want to explore. But beyond that, I don't think that if you actually want to deepen trade liberalization, you can really rely on the WTO. That's why our network of trade agreements is very important and why it's very good that we are now concluding a trade agreement with New Zealand. And we really hope that over the next 2 years before the end of this mandate, we can further make progress both on the ratification front and on the conclusion of trade negotiations. And of course, we also need to be looking into trade agreements in a manner which is not just looking into free trade agreements, but different ways in which you can actually enhance agreements as a platform for regulatory cooperation with third countries. That's why the TTC is an important model, and why we also need to be flexible. I would agree with Iana in looking into different types of engagement with third countries. Now, does that mean that we should only engage with friends? Well, it depends a little bit about how you define friends. As I said, we would aim to have a diversified trading relationship. At the same time, it's always going to be important for our trade relationship to show that we share some values. And from that point of view, I have to say sustainability is a fundamental value for the European Union. And that's why this new approach to sustainable development is certainly going to be something that is going to have a role in terms of our trade agreements, although it is something which is based very much on internationally agreed standards. It is not us trying to impose on others the European Union preference. So I think this has been a somewhat convoluted way, Bernard, to answer to your question. But in my view, it is clear that we would need to both work on the WTO front and to deepen our trade cooperation with countries in a manner which also facilitates resilience, facilitates diversification, taking into account that in a very unstable geopolitical environment, we need to be able to respond to shock. This is, by the way, why we also need our autonomous instruments. I mean, we want to engage with others, but we also need to have our autonomous instruments that give us the capacity to respond as necessary.
Thanks again, Ignacio. Last word, Cecilia or Iana? Cecilia. You're muted, Cecilia. Sorry.
I'm sorry. This is actually a bigger discussion on geopolitization of trade and deglobalization or globalization or whatever. But very briefly, of course, the trade today is much more value-based than it was before, and sustainability and respect for international conventions is there, and it is an important part of EU trade, and increasingly so for other partners as well. And also, of course, the pandemic and the war and so has taught us that we need to be much more diversified, flexible, innovative, and with some products, some medical products and some rare metals were very important for the green transition and so on. Europe is extremely dependent on one actor. And here, of course, we need to rethink, and we need to be more innovative on how we can do that. But resilience and flexibility does not come from concentration or at home or in your neighborhood. And many companies have been flexible without the state telling them to do so. They realize this as well. But today they have to take political consideration in a way that they did not have to do just a couple of years ago. Of course, sustainability is important and certain values, but I think we should be careful in imposing friendshoring in everything we trade with, because this will lead to less trade, more expensive trade, and ultimately it is the citizens who will pay for that.
Thanks, Cecilia. Last word, Iana, before we wrap up.
Yeah, on this friendshoring thing, I think the debate is very American. I find that this is very Washington talk, sort of friendshoring. You know, Cecilia Malmstrom was talking about doing trade with friends and allies in her time as commissioner, and von der Leyen has also taken up that thing. But I think the sort of the pragmatic, what kind of outcome this could lead to in an optimistic action-focused scenario for the EU is friendshoring would be concluding or ratifying the FTAs that have been ratified, because most of these partners are those values partners in one way or the other. Where the EU focus is a lot and will be, and I don't know how it will be resolved, is on things like critical raw materials, if it's targeted. For the rest, I think it's just there's no consensus on what this means. And actually, I would refer back to you and your colleagues as economists. Can you calculate what it would mean to de-shore from China and replace that with whoever else? How what are the costs and benefits of shoring what to where? That would be actually very interesting to do some in the interest of evidence-based trade policy. Thank you.
So we actually have a project on that, and I will involve some of you in that project.
Thanks, Bernard. I think on that note, we're going to have to draw proceedings to a close. I mean, it's impossible to sum up because we've touched on so many areas. It's incredible. I mean, so many hairs have been set running in my mind. So it's really difficult to sum up. But I guess my take is that the WTO is still important to the EU, is still central to its trade policy, but maybe the EU is not going to put all of its eggs in one basket, and it's going to, at the same time, explore other avenues, talk to other partners. And I think we heard quite a lot about sort of what is too much of a cliche, I suppose, but sort of value-based trade is guiding the EU in so many ways. And we had a bit of a warning from Iana in that connection about a possible bumpy ride ahead. So there's lots and lots of things, but I think the central message is that the EU still believes and wants a rules-based system. And I think we'll probably see that demonstrated in practice in the WTO reform process, which is about to unfold. It would be great to go into some of the more individual areas, like, such as Alan mentioned, about how to legitimize JSIs and all of that, but unfortunately, we just didn't have time. So on that note, although we maybe have not friend shored, I think maybe the Friends of Multilateralism have friend shared on this occasion, and that's at least something. So with that, I'd like to say big thank you to our three fantastic panelists for their deep insights and contributions. And thank you to everybody else for tuning in. Lou, should I hand it back to you to say goodbye, or?
Yeah, no, I just want to say that thanks a lot. I think I could say this on behalf of the whole FMG, that this new initiative from this session, we could see that it serves its purpose. We have developed into so many things and understand much better kind of the EU perspective on trade policy and as well as on the WTO. So with that, this will encourage us, of course, to continue with this initiative, and we'll do probably 2 more later this year with Washington and Beijing. Of course, this doesn't mean that we will lose sight of other key capitals that probably will do also in the future. But for the moment, I think that we will continue with this, and with these 3 key capitals, of course, that as a non-funded think tank in Geneva, a very peculiar animal. So we have a limitation. So we'll do as much as we can, but we'll continue with this initiative, and we look forward to engaging all of you in the future. So with that, I thank you very much for this, and looking forward to see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks. Goodbye.
All right.